Welcome to the next edition of Web Authoring with HTML. I am your host, Professor Fiske, and I want to jump right in and let's talk about some fundamentals, shall we? In this class, we're going to go over the Acadian Adventures website that I redesigned. And when I redesigned it, I used Bootstrap. Before I get into Bootstrap, I really want to talk to you about the way HTML is written. Now, HTML has different tags that do different things for us. And I'm not going to go too deep into what each tag means individually because we're going to go over each tag as the course progresses. But what I do want to do is I want to go over some of the tags that are extremely important to you getting started. The first tag I want to talk about is our head tag. I'm skipping HTML because it's a little obvious what it's doing. It's actually rendering the language of HTML to be read by the browser. But what does head mean? Well, normally when we look at our code, we're looking at our code in such a way, or when our code runs in the browser, the HTML is run from line 1 to the bottommost line in order. And that order is from top to bottom, left to right. So as this page loads in the browser, if I was going to load it very slowly, what would load first is line 1. Once line 1 is finished rendering or being interpreted, we would load line 2, and so on and so forth. And in each of these specific lines, we have programming statements, if you will, that instruct our browser to do certain things. Now, these programming statements are encapsulated in groups, and these groups are run sometimes all together, or in other situations, they're run one by one. In the case of the head is run one by one. And the reason why the head is run one by one is because normally the head has a lot of external files or external services that it's calling in order to render certain things within the page. Now, what do I mean by the word render? What I mean is there are certain things we need, certain sources that we need to give us some of the look and feel that we want to implement in our website. The other thing that the head does for us is it gives us the ability to compartmentalize and call out explicitly. Explicitly means that we're actually stating it and not hoping that the code understands what we mean through implying, right? So there's implicit, which is the implication that the code knows what we want. And then there's explicit, where the code is being told directly what to do. If you look here in the head, we have some meta tags. And what our meta tags allow us to do is to quantify very specifically how we want the browser to render what we are attempting to code. Both the viewport generator, and so on and so forth. If you look a little closer, there's other things here as well. For instance, the title. Now, the title might not seem like much at this moment, but if I took this browser URL, which is my REPL, and I ran this up here, you can see at the top, Acadian Adventures shows up as the name of the browser. Now, or as the name of the web page. Now, that's very important because Acadian Adventures is what I said I wanted the title of the web page to be. So you can already see that when the index.html runs, it's going to run the head first, right? There are other things in the head that are very important. For instance, mostly you're going to find your style sheets and your JavaScript files being run in the head. And as a best practice, you want your style sheets in the head, and you want your JavaScript files at the end of your page, normally at the bottom, and I'll show you that in a second. I have my JavaScript files in the body at the end. Some individuals separate the body from the footer. My footer is in the body, but that's neither here nor there. Now, you can see there's two types of styles that I'm using here. Now, when I talk about CSS styles, there are three ways that we can call our styles. We can either call a style sheet, which is an external file that sits outside of the HTML file or ASPX file or whatever type of web page we're building, if it is a web page. It sits outside the file. We call that a style sheet, and we call it using a link tag. So if I want to call a style sheet that exists outside of my index.html, in this case, I would need to call the style sheet using the link tag, And then I would need to define where it is. Now, you can see that there's some implication here, right? The implication is that the browser knows that I want to go up one folder from where this folder exists, and then I want to access assets, dist, and then the file itself, which is styles.css. Styles.css within the context of this specific project is our CSS style sheet. You can see down here that we are ingesting a bootstrap.min CSS style sheet, and that exists, it should exist if you're following along using the coding paradigms that, or the code base that I've developed in your assets folder as well. The second way we can call CSS files, or CSS styles I should say, not files, is by creating a style tag in the page and then adding our CSS styles directly to the style tag. Now, this is not best practice. Normally you want to modularize your styles in another file so that when you compile all of them together, in most situations you want to compile your CSS files into one main file and then deploy that when your website deploys. In this case, we're not doing deployments, but you don't want this in your page, because what the style sheet gives you is the ability to take that style sheet and put it on another page without having to write that specific style over and over again, and thus having to update many different places if that style changes. Whereas in this case, having the style directly in the page does give us a little more power, right? It overrides whatever style sheets we're calling, right? Because from order of operations, there is the least powerful, which is the style sheet, and then we're moving into the more explicit, right? Remember what I said, explicit. Being explicit means we're telling the file directly what to do. We're telling the actual code directly what to do. And the style sheet is more implicit, right? The style sheet exists outside of the HTML file. Whereas if I have a style tag in my HTML page, that tag will be more explicit, meaning it'll have more power over the style sheet. So if I call my style directly in the page, like I'm doing here, and then add CSS styles as such, what will happen is the styles that exist in this style tag will override the styles that exist in the style sheet, which is why I have these styles directly in the page. There's a third way you can call styles, right? The third way you can call styles is what's called an inline style. Now, an inline style is a style that exists directly on the HTML tag. So if you look right here, this inline style is directly on the HTML tag, and that's very important because this HTML style is giving us the power that we're looking for at that moment in time. We're not necessarily really caring too much about modularity or implicit design with our CSS because we want to override everything, right? And then there's one more way you can actually do this. So you don't necessarily have to use inline styles to do an override. You can actually just come to the end of here in your style sheet, of course. You can say important, and that'll actually make it the most powerful, the most explicit that you can make it. But in this case, what I want to do is I want to look at this from the perspective of the style sheet versus styles in the head versus inline styles, as you see here. This is our head in a nutshell. The head, like I said, normally does not contain JavaScript files because you want your JavaScript files to render after the HTML has been rendered. You do not want your JavaScript files to complete before that, and it can cause issues if it does. In this case, I do have it here. It's a minified from the Bootstrap libraries that we're using in this class. So it doesn't really matter if it's at the front, but I also, at the end, REPL does do this, but if I use REPL to pull in the Bootstrap minified JS file, I'll pull it at the bottom. And since I already have it at the bottom, I'm going to go ahead and delete it from the top because I don't need to call it twice. And that's the head in a nutshell. The next grouping of HTML elements is your body. And what your body does is it contains all of the things that you normally see in your website. The header, the masthead, the navigation, your, start off image and content and all that. And that exists inside of your body. And why that's important is because your body is where a lot of the magic happens. Your body is where the code that you want your users to see exists, right? And I'm not going to show this off too much because this is actually an assignment that I want you to complete. I'm kind of glossing through it so you don't necessarily try to glean any of the work ahead of time. But lastly, there is the footer. Now, the footer doesn't necessarily have to be in the body, as I have it here. But the footer normally is either below the body or in the body at the end, as I have it here. What you'll also see is comments. So the last thing I want to touch on here is comments. I put comments in all of my HTML because I honestly know, I know for a fact that my HTML may become unwieldy. It may become very large. This is 193 lines. All right, this is a very small HTML page. There are some pages that can be thousands of lines. And in certain situations, if your code is not already modularized, meaning it's not built in modules, where you can actually easily go in and modify those modules and components, as we're going to do using Bootstrap, it'll make life a lot harder for you when you're trying to fix the code or modify the code, update, create new code in specific places that aren't easy to understand. Well, I want to stop there. I don't want to go too far with this class because I'm going to go a little deeper into the way this works and how it works for you going forward using the head and the body along with the Bootstrap components to get us where we want to be. Well, that's all I have for today. As I say in all my videos, good luck, have fun, ciao.